Welcome, everyone, to the TopCyberPro podcast. I'm the founder and CEO of TopCyberPro.com, Jim West, and I'm here today with another great guest that's going to give us a great perspective into a role in cybersecurity that's super tremendously important, especially more and more these days with companies being hacked and breached every day, looking for direction and guidance on where to take the security program. So without further ado, I want to introduce Naveen. And he has been a CISO for several years. And so a CISO is a Chief Information Security Officer. So this is an executive role that works with the CEO, works with the CIO, works with all the executives to ensure that security operations are being done on a daily basis, not just on one day a month or 1 month a year. It's 24/7. It's never ending. So without further ado, Naveen, can you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your career?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. So I've been working in cyber and information security now for coming up to 27 years, so quite a significant amount of time. I started my career funny enough, in application development. So I never went to university. I don't have a degree. So it's an important point because I'll come back to that later. And straight out of school, college, I managed to get a programming gig in HP 3000. So if you're as old as me, you'll understand how tedious coding in HP 3000 is. So I did that for a few years and worked in several organizations before I got my first real taste of cybersecurity when I joined Deutsche Bank in the 1990s, in the late 90s, as a security administrator. And that's really kind of what fueled my passion and desire into the cyber world. I got my first glimpse of what it meant to protect an organization from, I would say, the sort of ground up. Understanding the role that administrators play, and then looking at it from the perspective I'm coming from now, which is relatively different. It's been a vast career in financial services, oil and gas, and utility sector, and some in government. So yeah, it's a really exciting journey that I've taken, I think, over the last 30 years plus in this industry, and watching it evolve has been fantastic.
Well, there's a lot that you said there that I'd like to kind of come and ask a few questions, if you don't mind. First off, you mentioned the late 1990s. So, you experienced the Y2K, debacle as it was globally, how there was a lot of anxiety and worry about what would happen when the zeros hit. And so could you maybe share any humorous stories or what you recall from the Y2K?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite funny. I think there was general panic across the business world. And I was working in financial institutions at the time. And so, there were these huge programs of work, put in place to ensure, that as soon as, the year 2000 hit, systems didn't fall over. So I kind of learned a lot about organizational structure, about management, about the way that we perceive things in industry, and I think it's a takeaway that if you understand how technology was written back then, with big mainframes and VMS systems and all this kind of stuff, right? I could understand why the logic sat with a certain few people that this is all going to fail. But the interesting thing is, for things that they didn't change, it didn't fail. It just continued as normal. So I could understand where there were limitations in applications and services, and with the real push of the internet, where you had different technologies, right, coming in. So yeah, it was fun to watch to a degree, but also I think the amount of money that was invested in that change was astronomical for stuff that didn't really occur. So,
Y2K, I worked in a chemical facility at that time. And of course, all those industrial systems, which, in the past 10 years, ICS industrial, systems controls have become a very big focal point of security. But even back then, it was terrifying because a lot of plants didn't know if they would have to do full shutdowns if the systems they relied on or to monitor them to ensure things don't go bad. they were considering full shutdowns. And it was interesting because most people, as you know, in the IT side of the world, most of the people were like, well, just go ahead and set computers forward to that time, let it roll over, and then see what your systems do. Like you should be able to do a test like that. What people didn't realize was back then in the 90s, there was so many companies making motherboards. There was so many companies making embedded and different components of the computers that today you still have a lot of variety, but back then it was insane. There was like a new motherboard coming out every month, and you didn't have the like when back then you could order a couple hundred computers, but that was only like your really big established companies. So for a lot of businesses, they didn't know one, they didn't have asset control, so they didn't know what they had. Two, they didn't fully understand all of the interdependencies of their layered systems that they kept adding stuff to over the years. So of course it was terrifying because you would sometimes only need one system to fail. And that was the issue. They didn't know whether it would stop or not. And so it was a very high anxiety time, especially for the financial sector, because in the financial sector, integrity is everything. Making sure all the accounts and the balances are accurate, the transactions are tracked effectively for legal and for obvious reasons. But I remember there was so many analysts that would come out at that time saying there is not enough time to make paper copies of all the account records. That's just how many records they deal with. And so there's no time to print everything. So therefore, we got to roll the dice. And luckily, as history shows us it wasn't that big of a deal, but it was interesting the psychology of how everybody had high anxiety. IT teams were working around the clock, and definitely developers and programmers as well. So that brings me to another question. You mentioned you started off with application development, working with coding. What were some of the early languages? How far back does this go? Does this rabbit hole go with coding
My God.
languages for you?
My God, I think the first thing I ever coded was in BASIC. So I actually had, I think I was about 12 or 13. And I was terrible at maths, very terrible at algebra and trigonometry and things like that. So I actually ended up coding a small application to help me solve my trigonometric equations. So,
Hey, whatever works.
whatever works, right? And then Fortran and Pascal and things like that. So really old stuff. And then more into sort of C++ and things like that. So it was fun. I think coding is very different now. It's an entirely different ball game. But I think having some level of understanding of how application architecture works at a very young age, at the beginning, and I think that's why it's really important. I think if you look at how we can help change a kind of younger mindset into cybersecurity, coding is where I would encourage everyone to start. And if your kids have an aptitude for it, get into it at the age of 8, 9. There are so many resources available that weren't available to us back then. And I think it gives you a good foundational view of how cybersecurity starts at a really simple level. So yeah, and I think my when I went to college or when I was doing my BTech, I ended up coding in B tree. I don't know if you're familiar with B tree. It's a sort of library language. Sits on the back end of C++. And so I ended up doing this sort of video. I wanted to catalog all my CDs and my videos and all this kind of stuff. So but then I was like, okay, I want to protect it. So I think there came the level of a sort of granular understanding of what I needed to do in order to protect what I was putting onto that database, right? So understanding security in its most basic level, at that time. And I think that natural view of, okay, I want to maintain backups. I want to be able to add and change things, but I don't want anyone else to do it, right? So you start to get intrigued by what security looks like. And I don't know if you remember that there was a movie called War Games back in the 80s, Matthew Broderick. And I think that watching that in the 80s kind of gave me the added mystery of, is it that simple? Can you go in and just take a modem and dial something in and it talks to you, right? It was a whole new world.
Oh yeah.
You know so in the most geekiest way, movies and sci-fi and Star Trek and so on and so forth, they add to that whole kind of genre of wanting to learn about things that you probably you're exposed to, but then don't get the chance to do it, right? So yeah.
It's amazing when you think going all the way back to the early 90s when computers started becoming, commercially available to households, and you start looking at how people just in mass drove into like the internet relay chat rooms, all of the texting through the internet and emails. Everybody all of a sudden was just putting things down, and then so we, kind of temporarily abandoned the telephone and went over to digital. Then, as the cell phone, came out and became prevalent, where we now are walking around with these mini personal computers in our hands. Then it came, instead of just texting and messaging, it slowly went back to, and like today, it's like all about video calls and trying to be more personable. It's weird to see the kind of ebbs and flows of how humans communicate or prefer to communicate. Because at one point, people used to buy ringtones, right? They would pay, two, three, five, sometimes $10 for a tune to play as a ringtone. And now almost 9 out of 10 people have their phones on silent because they don't want to be bothered with the noise, right? Um, so I was looking at your website and your business for Cybertree Paradox, and there's a page on there that had an interesting statement, and it said, "Not all technology is good for you." And so, we just talked about the Y2K where it brought a lot of anxiety, and nowadays, it seems like corporations are more open and ready to embrace emerging technology. Like now the big buzzword is AI and machine learning, and eventually in a few years it'll be quantum computing. But it seems like companies are quick to like try to immediately take advantage of whatever advancements in technology, obviously if it supports business operations and goals. What can you expand upon that thought about not all technology is good for you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in my experience, having worked with businesses of all sizes, large, small, corporate, I think there is a general sense, with organizations to rush in some cases to adopt technologies because it's fashionable, right? But doesn't necessarily serve a purpose, for that particular organization, or they are potentially over ambitious in their goals. I think that I see technology as a utility. So if I run a small business, I need enough technology to be able to enable me to run my business successfully, and I don't want to overcook that. And it's really hard sometimes when you're in those startup stages to truly understand what level of technology you're going to need to apply in order to do whatever you need to do successfully. And I think as businesses grow, they need to take stock. And I think having long-term strategies is great, but looking at it tactically, what benefit does that technology actually provide me, and is it going to enhance my business in any particular way, shape, or form? Is it going to make our lives easier? So, let's take automation as a really good example. You can't get to the point of automation unless you've understood what business processes you have, right? So what can I allow a machine to do on my behalf, and what does it, need from a human interaction perspective? I think sometimes those questions are not answered in the right way. So we tend to, as human beings, probably overcomplicate and in some cases over-engineer our own thought processes that then get translated into over-engineered and overthought technologies. What I think, is a much more subtle way is to say, well, what is it that I need to achieve, and how am I going to get there? And what do I need to invest in it, effectively in order for it to work? So if you look at large, financial services and big banks, that have global footprints, they're struggling in some ways to compete with fintechs and other types of new age technologies, because technology is now so scalable, right? And it's much cheaper. What does it cost to to run a virtual machine, a couple of dollars, right? It's hugely different to the investment that you would have to make in physical, infrastructure, a long time ago. And so I would encourage people to, take a step back, look at your business activity as a whole, truly understand, what it is that you're trying to achieve, and then take a broad stroke view of the types of technology that you need to invest in. So if we take the Middle East, for example, when it comes to security technologies, and I think you and I spoke about this before, but it's very much, let's go buy the nice shiny tin, right?
Yeah.
So if it's got a brand name, it's got to be good. So if it's Cisco, Microsoft, whatever, it's got to be amazing. It's not necessarily the case. You could invest in those technologies, but make sure it's appropriate for you as a business.
Mm-hmm.
Don't buy something because it's got a brand. Yeah, it doesn't help you, as an organization. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's the same thing when people talk about like pharmaceutical drugs, right? You have the generic, the actual chemical that's going to do the thing that you need it to do. Then you have the brand of that chemical. And so it's like, well, the generic will do the same thing you need it to do as the brand name. It's just this costs $10, this costs 150.
Yeah.
You do bring up a good point about the whole embracing of technology if it's not appropriate, and a lot of companies, they do focus on the bottom line, and their bottom line is money, or it's trying to create an efficiency or automation that sometimes they're not ready for. A great example is, I think the first major industry that got really hit hard by AI was a lot of call center operations, and a lot of businesses rely on call centers because that's the first interaction your customers have to your business. And so there was multiple stories how, I forget which was the first major business, but he fired, I mean, almost 90 something percent of his call center staff and used AI. Now, granted, from the ticket perspective and the numbers, it showed great efficiency. It showed that he was going to save all this money by employing AI to do that first. But the thing is, there was a few studies done on that where the customer satisfaction dropped a little bit. It didn't drop a lot, but it dropped a little bit. And the concern there should be, when you're trying to turn over a business operation to an AI system, make sure you thoroughly don't just keep the bottom line in mind. You also got to keep the customer experience, because at the end of the day, you should have a customer focus. Obviously, as a CISO, your customer may be the business, but that business has a customer that you also need to be mindful of. So I often caution a lot of cyber professionals, when they are working for their customers, understand that your customers have customers. And so you need to keep all of the big picture in mind when you were dealing with incorporating, implementing, and integrating these new technology, and automating our business processes. Um, you've done a lot of great work. You worked across a lot of different sectors. It's 24/7. As I tell people, once you get into cyber and you get to a certain level, it's almost every day. You got to live and breathe it. I'm sure you wake up and you got, all your various news feeds, trying to stay on top of what's going on in the industry, etc. But this is a good question that a lot of people, would probably want to know. What motivates you?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think it's rather simple for me. I think my passion in wanting to be constructively disruptive in this market by saying, actually, you know what, cybersecurity isn't just for large corporates. It isn't just for big business. I think there's a national interest in wanting to ensure that mom and pop shops are protected. The guy that runs the grocery store that does an online, small distribution for his local customers, right, is protected. Anyone that's doing online shops or whatever it may be, I think we have that there's something unifying in wanting to have a much bigger focus around the national conversation when it comes to cybersecurity. So if I can do my part in helping educate end users, individuals, people, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and actually what's important to you, why is cybersecurity so important? I think in the next 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to see accelerated disruption in this space. We recently just witnessed, a couple of major outages, right? And I think for smaller businesses that don't have the knowledge and don't understand it, and I hear it all the time, and I'm sure you do too. It's never going to impact me. It's never going to, it's not going to disrupt me. I think the most recent outage, with Microsoft and CrowdStrike is a good example of how even the smallest businesses can be impacted, right? If your whole reliance is on just putting all your eggs in one basket, even as a small business, you're going to be impacted. And so where you then veer into that sort of national threat actor space, as an external threat actor, I'm not going to waste my time trying to bring down a large multinational financial services organization. I want the lowest common denominator that's going to cause the biggest disruption, and that's me, you, and everyone else that runs services at home or businesses. So my motivation is about education. It's about really trying to demystify cybersecurity for the masses, so that they can start to relate to it in their own personal space, and then they can take that into their workplace and be a bit more informed, because once you're informed, you can make educated choices. You can make educated decisions.
You bring up a very good point about education is key to everything in cyber. It starts from the receptionist at the front door all the way to the stakeholders, the C-suite, all the way at the top. Everybody in between is a stakeholder in security operations. Recently in the news, actually in the past few days, a U.S. presidential candidate, his campaign internal emails and documents were hacked through a spear phishing attack, which they're early attributing to Iranian hackers, but whether or not that gets verified or confirmed to be determined. But the bottom line is it was a spear phishing attack. Microsoft actually announced that a presidential candidate had been hacked. They had announced this maybe a day or two before they finally admitted it was them. But long story short, it only takes one person to click the link, right? And like in a spear phishing campaign, you mentioned small to medium businesses. A lot of these businesses sometimes think, it's what they see in the news, the perception. It's like, it's just Microsoft, it's just IBM, it's just the NSA, the FBI offices getting hacked. No, if they can hack the big corporations, which have long-standing and matured security programs in place and have budgets of potentially millions of dollars for cyber, what do you stand a chance as a small or medium business? And sometimes it's all due to their perspective that, well, I'm not a concern to nation state hackers, which may be true, but they don't understand that there's continuous hacking campaigns that are automated for the most part, that all they do is once they get an email list, they start blowing out their operation. They're scripted emails, and all they need is, as soon as you click the link, it's not that there's another person just waiting for you to click the link. It is a scripted action by a system that's waiting for those responses to come back to do the next step of the attack. They don't understand that all of this is largely automated, and that it's just a never-ending wave after wave of attacks that are happening, that at any moment, any employee or any individual that's connected to your network that has any kind of access, your business could be just completely ransomware. It could be, your files could be deleted. Your accounts could be taken over. Again, people don't understand the threat is nonstop, and that having just starting with education, which just takes some time. Invest the time. It should be low cost. Cyber education should be no to low cost, as I like to say, to get everybody in your company educated. Because just because you're a small mom and pop shop to a medium-sized business, you are actually more at risk because you can't afford the millions of dollars of CM tools, of analyzers and other systems that's going to help proactively protect your network. So it's more crucial, I think, to small, medium businesses. And I think that is a sector that needs a lot of attention and love from the cybersecurity industry. And hopefully they get it in the next few years, because they are the most vulnerable, So with that, I wanted to talk about, you mentioned earlier in your introduction, you mentioned that you did not get a degree. And I definitely want to touch upon this, because a lot of folks, I started a business, of course, this is a Top Cyber Pro podcast, but a lot of folks that don't know the story, I had a friend of mine that was about to get a loan from a bank for, I think it was like $13,000 to take a course. I won't name the university, but during the COVID shutdown, they had lost their job in the oil and gas industry in Houston, Texas, and they were about to go get a very substantial loan to pay for, I think it was a 6-month program, cybersecurity program, where because it was COVID, it was all virtual, so it'd all be online, a lot of labs, a lot of video training, etc. And they luckily, before they went to the bank, they messaged me and said, "Hey, what can you look at this course and tell me what you think about it?" And in the course, I think they had, like I said, labs, virtual instruction. But at the end of that course, I was looking like, well, are they going to give them like a Security Plus voucher? What kind of certifications will they end up with? It was zero. And I said, well, so they're just going to get a little paper, a certificate of completion of the 6-month course. That's worth $0 in the industry. Now, maybe some of the experience and knowledge that they would gain through those labs might be of a minimal value, but honestly, most businesses hire you based upon certain credentials that you have to bring with you. Certifications and degrees is where it comes to. And then, of course, experience is important, which we could talk about. But I looked at that like that's almost, I think it was about $13,000 for 6 months of training. And I said, no, I would much rather you go take two or three boot camps and end up with 2 or 3 certifications for that kind of money. But I said, look, if you're just getting started, you're coming from a completely different sector and you're now having to transition into IT cyber. I said, look, start with what I call YouTube University. And I sent them a couple channels and resources, say, hey, start watching these videos. It costs you nothing but time. And once you get to the point that you want to learn more, I'll send you more links. Luckily, that person avoided paying, getting that a massive bank loan, which would have been financially crippling to them, considering they had no income coming in. They lost their job. But that inspired me to start Top Cyber Pro. And I started it to be a very low cost, affordable, cancel anytime. I don't do contracts. I absolutely hate locking people into contracts. But I said, $50 a month. I advocate for most people. It should only take you 30 days to study and get a certification. And I say that because a lot of folks I hear, 32 years of my career, I've heard it from every age and level of person. I'm going to take the next 6 to 12 months to study for this cert. No, you're not going to take 6 to 12 months. What's going to happen in that 6 to 12 months is life happens. If you have children, they're going to have doctor visits, they're going to have band practice or soccer practice. If you have a spouse, you're going to have issues that you need to tend to as a family. Even if you're a single person, you're going to have a wedding to attend. You got a family reunion to attend, a funeral. Life events happen in our lives that distract us, or there'll be major projects that come at your job that completely take all your focus away. When you come home, the last thing you want to do is study. So I tell people you have to have a focused sprint to the finish line, set 30 days. So I usually tell people, look, sign up for 1 month. When you're ready to start getting your cert, sign up for 1 month, study, then get your cert, and then cancel membership. My business partners hate me for this because they're like, we need to have they're looking at it from the business perspective, the bottom line. I look at it from a customer perspective because I was that person 30 some years ago where I was like, all these courses and programs cost thousands and thousands of dollars. Which one do I get? Which one's going to get me the most money in the market? All these questions that, you would have when you're getting your career started on day one. It seems like a huge mountain to climb. But with all that being said, Naveen, I'd like to get your perspective because a lot of people in the industry, this comes up a lot, this discussion about certifications, degrees, and experience. So as a CISO, let me start with the perspective. If you was having to build a team for, let's say, a SOC, a Security Operations Center, and you're having to balance, what to you in that perspective would you stack as the most important, next most important, and the final from certifications, degrees, and experience?
So I would probably always start with the experience, right? So practical experience is the most valuable. If somebody has done a degree 20 years ago in computer science, it's pretty much irrelevant today. So I don't really count a degree as a benchmark for a cybersecurity role. I think qualifications have their place because some people just have natural talent and don't necessarily need to go down that route. And with others, they need to learn. So, it could be ultimately what's right for you. And I think there are a lot of accredited bodies out there. Again, they're businesses themselves, right? They need to make revenue. I think that fundamentally, as a CISO, my focus has always been on a couple of things. One is um, I don't focus too much on their technical capability from day one, because we can teach them that, right? So if you're interested in cybersecurity or information security, and you're coming from a background that doesn't exist, you haven't done this before, then fundamentally, we need to understand how you think, the logic of your thinking, the type of person you are you kind to others, you know all of what we refer to as soft skills, I actually think are more important than diving into technical skills, because technical skills can be taught. And I said, people that have natural talent, you don't need to teach them these things, right? There's a big, and I think, I don't know how it is with your perception, but I think there are a lot of neurodiverse people in cybersecurity, right? And especially on the technical level. So your point about what do we look for? Well, we're always looking for that uniqueness in someone, right? What star shines in each individual, and I think it's really important to embrace the differences people have, because you may not naturally be a good communicator, but you're very good technically, right?
Yeah.
And I think organizations need to do more to adjust to that type of thinking. So you could pass on someone because they don't match your mold of what a security operations manager looks like, right? Maybe their preferred method of communication, goes back to a point you made earlier, is to text and not to get onto a video chat. You've got to understand people better, because we are a people business, right? If we don't embrace those differences in people, the way we think, the logic of the way we think, right? And that aptitude, it's very difficult to then, build a team. So I would always say, as a CISO, if you're the smartest person in the room, get out, go find another room, right?
Yep.
You need to surround yourself with people that have the skill sets that you don't have, in order to make your team run as a team. If you employ people that just look and sound like you, well, you're not going to get very far, right? So yeah, I think it's really important to have an open mind about when you're hiring, when you're putting people in position. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it's important in some professions to have degrees. Like, I would want my doctor to have a degree, right? I want the guys running nuclear power plants to have some sort of
So you
nuclear
wouldn't
physics.
want your brain surgeon to just have went to a 30-day course online?
Yeah, exactly.
That's
Right.
like,
And I'm sure there's some organizations that exist. Yeah, it's like that guy that's selling land on Mars at the moment, right? He's trying to. Yeah. So it is a really interesting field, and I think with the advancements in technology and the pace that we're moving, I suppose in the last 20 years. I mean, there are certain things my nieces and nephews can do with technology that I look at, how do you do that? So, it's a natural evolution of things. I think that what's really interesting is that employers need to embrace that change, and I'm not seeing that, right? So I saw a few adverts on LinkedIn over the last few weeks, and I've started to notice that for cybersecurity roles, they're post these huge job descriptions, right? With these huge accountabilities. And first of all, I want to ask, who on earth is advising them to put all of this stuff down on paper, right? Because it's like this wish list of impossibility. They're seeking a graduate to, have you just recently graduated? Right, you need all of this skill in order to come and do this job. It's
oh my
ridiculous.
goodness. Well, we know that a lot of HRs are copy paste factories, right? They'll take a copy paste from each other, and they'll end up, like you said, with all these exuberant lists of responsibilities and tasks that you have to do for that role. Where that most I've even seen it down to lower level roles will be requiring you to wear two, three, four hats of different positions into one. And they don't understand that sometimes with specialization and people, what they tend to gravitate towards one part of the industry or another, that having someone that can be multi-hatted, that can effectively wear all those hats, it's not as common as they would think. And they just think, well, this long list of things can be done by an individual, they're not accounting for other things too, not just the expertise and the skill set and the experience, but they also got to account for if they are truly doing all those tasks, wearing all those hats. Lately there's been a lot of articles about burnout, IT and cyber burnout in industry because our folks are being overworked, with salary positions and overtime and losing their weekends and nights. They're experiencing burnout and saying, you know what, I'm done with this industry. There's been a few prominent figures even that I won't name drop here, but there's been a few prominent figures that have completely left cyber, said, I'm good. I'm going to go and do something that's a little bit more low stress because they value their work-life balance. But you bring up a good point about how all these job postings, there's another thing I've seen too, where they always lead with a degree, X number of years experience, and certifications. They want the trifecta. And what I've advised many, many businesses is use the or. Remember the Boolean language when you're doing a library catalog search, and or? Do use it and/or. It gives you options. You don't just lock yourself into, if we don't have at least a bachelor's degree, 10 years experience, and these 2 certifications, you're not qualified. You are just cutting the field of potential candidates down to the roots. And so you really got to consider that as an organization. You got to be more open-minded because a person that, let's say, maybe has just a Sec Plus, does not have their degree yet, but they've been at home working on VMs and been building machines in their bedroom, is probably the best fit for you because that's a person that can not only learn about your organization, meaning have a vested interest to really, truly embed themselves in your organization and your operations. They can grow with your organization. Whereas if you bring in this rock star that's got 10 plus years experience, the degree, the certifications, you bring them in, he might be there 1 year. And all of the money that's going to cost to bring that person in, them to barely learn your organization, and they're gone in a year or 2 years, that's not really growth. That's not the kind of employee you want to grow in your organization. So I often advise use the or degree and/or certifications and/or experience. Open up your potential, candidate pool, and do your interviews so you can get those things like the soft skills, as you mentioned. Soft skills are everything because you can have geniuses on your team, but if they can't communicate with your board, with your user base, then they're ineffective. So some people can translate the knowledge and experience they have to users better than others. And then, like I said, you build a team, you got to have multiple perspectives, people that might come from the defense sector, from the chemical industry, from financial, having these different perspectives gives you better vantage viewpoints when you're tackling problems because they bring that with them. Now, on the flip side of that, I will be quick to say, because a lot of people are like, yeah, but that could be a problem too. Because this one time on my team, we brought a guy that worked the DOD his whole life in military, and our organization wasn't that strict on policies and so forth. And I get it. You can have individuals that have been in the industry too long. Just as you mentioned, someone that had a degree from 20 years ago, they're looking at a 20-year ago perspective, and cyber's changed a lot. So this is where I do value certs in a way, because certs have what's called a continuing education requirement, where you have to renew it. You have to demonstrate, training and maintaining your education in the industry. And so I do say, personally, I do value certifications over degrees just for that alone, the continuing education component. And plus too, the cost and time it takes to get. Again, I would not advocate for someone starting in cyber, hey, go sign up for this 2 to 4 year degree program or whatever university. I would first tell someone, start with YouTube, what I call YouTube University, because it's free, doesn't cost you nothing. And then once you go from there, there are certain other websites depending on the field. Like, if you want to go into pen testing and auditing, I would say, like try Hack Me, Hack the Box, etc., because they're low cost to no cost. But what are some, I guess, websites, websites or news sites that you would recommend for someone that wants to start their journey into cyber, learning about, cybersecurity? Is there anything that you can recommend?
So I think for me, one of my resources that I use to date, and actually it's been really good, is SC Magazine. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
SC Magazine, yes.
Yeah. So I think they do have quite a balanced news segment, and very up to date in the way that they provide it. But there's also a lot of learning resources on there for individuals that want to learn more about cybersecurity. The other thing I think is watch TikTok. There are so many TikToks out there with people talking about cybersecurity now, a lot more than there used to be. And I think TikTok is a good way to get fast news and up to date stuff, and it isn't marred with a lot of mainstream media conversations. So it's another good resource that I use in order to
Especially with
develop.
the short format. You don't have to watch a 40-minute introduction about their family history and what they had for lunch to get to the information you need, right? A lot of YouTube videos will run really, really long, whereas a TikTok, it's like 1, 2 minutes, you get the information you need, you're ready to go. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, just following up on some of the comments you made about the education piece, I think if you're a CISO or an aspiring CISO, you have to remember that you're part of a business. Yeah, you're not running a security company, right? You have to focus on a couple of things. And one of the things I learned as part of my journey was negotiation. So if understanding how to negotiate with people to achieve the best outcomes, understanding when to be a diplomat and how to diplomatically speak to members of the board, your executive committee, your leadership, your staff, right? The people that work with you. But most importantly, it's about taking people on a journey, the collectivism of it. You're not sitting in an ivory tower. And I think CISOs that sit in ivory towers and throw stones, yeah, they don't last very long. Yeah. You're there to enable your business to achieve its business objectives and goals in the most secure way as possible. Everything else is then a balance of risk, right? And your job is not to police and not to enforce, it's to advise. And I think the point you made about someone coming from the DoD and trying to work in industry, well, they're a product of their environment, right? Whereas someone working in financial services wouldn't be able to go jump in and do a DoD cybersecurity role. They would be like, well, you guys are OTT, and having worked with various UK government entities, I know sometimes you can end up with someone's menu being classified, right? So the over protectiveness of one element and the ease of use. Look at universities, yeah, right, totally open and compromised during COVID. Yeah, there was a lot of information theft on universities. So I think you've got to be able to balance out the way that you are, regardless of industry sector. You as a CISO need to understand that fundamentally majority of your role is about ensuring the business is secure in its current operation, right? And managing that, because financially, as going back to one of the earlier questions, if you invest in technology that has no application, just because it has a brand, you're wasting a lot of resources, you're wasting a lot of money. So, cybersecurity is about being practical. Now, of course, as an industry, we move a lot slower than criminal organizations. We have to wait for approval to do certain things, within our roles, right? They only stretch so far. Criminals don't; they just go and do stuff. Right? Yeah. So I do think that there has to be a bit of latitude, right, in the way that cybersecurity is run, which doesn't at the moment. It's still seen as a technical problem. It's still seen as an IT issue, and you can clearly see that with the way that reporting lines are structured, right? So I would ask a slightly different question and say, well, are we really part of the C-suite? We have the chief title, but does that really mean that cybersecurity professionals have authority, apart from within huge organizations, right? The multi-billion-dollar organizations where that role is potentially now regulated. It requires a certain degree of qualification. But in the past, the cybersecurity lead would be someone from IT that was eventually elevated into that position. So I think we've got to be able to look at ourselves and say, right, what's the reality of where the CISO sits, but does it really matter who that person reports to, as long as they have the authority to do, what they need to do. And I think it's a vicious circle. So I see a lot of it changed in financial services and petrochem, but in some organizations, the CIO still runs the show. And so where's the accountability, right? And you're kind of marking your own homework if you're sitting within an IT function, first line of defense. There has to be some level of independence, which doesn't exist. So I mean, I go back a few years and I look at, you go audit some of these organizations, and you think, my God, the amount of control failure that existed, within IT, and the amount of cover-ups that people used to do, just actually, it's
they still do.
No, they still do, but I mean, I don't remember Barings Bank, when Barings failed, in the early 2000s, and that was literally because of access control failures. Front office were able to create accounts, and fool the back office, right? And that guy racked up $100 million worth of, trading deficits within a few days, and $850, million failure. So, I think, and then we had over regulation, and then now everyone's saying, oh, it's too much, and we need to go back. So where's the balance, right? And I think it's really important to understand how progressive technology is nowadays. If we don't understand what we're technically creating, how are we going to protect it? It's a real challenge.
So what I'd like to do right now, Naveen, is I kind of like to do the speed round of questions, kind of we've been talking a lot of, CISO and a lot of technical jargon and certs and education. And at this point, I want to do a little bit of levity, some fun questions. So there's no right or wrong answer. So I'm just going to hit you with just a couple of questions, and just, again, no right or wrong answer. Okay. So let's start with Star Wars or Star Trek?
Oh, that's so difficult. Star Trek.
Star Trek? Okay. Is a hot dog a sandwich?
No.
All right, let's shift into what is your most favorite book?
It's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. I absolutely love that book.
Actually, I did not plan on that answer coming from you. When I was a young child, I read that book almost like 2, 3 times a year. For some reason, I just was enthralled by Jules Verne and that particular book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So it's interesting you mentioned that. That was one of my early favorite childhood books. What about the book did it really draw you in?
Well, I think it was the whole concept of reading about someone who was living in the 1800s talk about this sophisticated mechanical submarine where, it's the imagination, right? In a similar breath. I mean, all of his books were great, From Earth to the Moon, literally building a projectile to get to the moon, 80 Days Around the World, another amazing story. So I just think his ingenuity was just so beyond his time, right?
Yes.
Like he imagined things that practically happened, right? So his ancestors must be so proud of the fact that his generations that went beyond it. But I think he just captured a whole generation of readers, and the fact that we're still talking about that 150 years after the author passed, that's also astonishing to me. So for us, kind of our generation, I don't know, this feels like the modern day Shakespeare, but he was talking in a very technical language. So yeah, it's really cool.
Cool. What I like to do now is, we talked about, you serving as a CISO for multiple different businesses and different industries, but let's kind of, the person watching this right now, they're like, okay, I hear CISO, I know what it stands for, but what does that look like? So could you maybe walk us through a day or a week in the life of a CISO? What are some of the common tasks you got to do, functions and things and responsibilities, so that anyone watching this will have a better understanding?
Sure. So it's a great question, and no one given day is the same, and no one given week is the same. So, but I can give you a sense of what it means to fulfill that role, and I think there are a couple of things. One is about stakeholder management. It's really understanding who your key customers are within the business. And I look at it from a perspective of understanding, if you truly want to be able to put in an effective strategy of, protecting an organization, you have to understand what it does. And I think a lot of CISOs or a lot of security people focus on what's in front of them rather than just the bigger picture, right? So truly understanding how your business operates, you can only get through interaction with your business leaders and your operational leaders. So stakeholder management is key for me. It's keeping in touch with what the business is doing and why it's doing it. So that generates a kind of business as usual functionality for the team. Whether that's someone new coming into the organization, someone leaving the organization, someone changing roles within an organization. So we have to be able to manage that change. But it's also looking at it from an operational perspective. So what's happening with technology infrastructure, what's happening with the application stack, what's happening with our third parties, what are they up to, what are they doing, what's happening with changes to architecture, is there anything new the business is trying to implement within that given week, is there something old they're trying to decommission, so it's a circular kind of perspective on things. And so on one end, you're managing this very operational, functional business. And on the other hand, you have to then look at, how are you managing that risk? How have you effectively implemented control? How are you looking at, compliance and legal and regulatory requirements that the business might need? And most importantly, how are you educating people? So you kind of have a dual role in ensuring that the organization understands what its obligations are from a practical perspective, and then making sure that they do it from an operational one.
Wow.
And
I usually, when people ask about what does it take to really, advance a business, I like you use that term instead of enforcing on a business, you should be helping to advance it. I usually tell people it's really the key theme I tell people, it's about being plugged into industry, plugged into the changes of the threat landscape, threat actors, all that knowledge, plugged into the technologies you're doing. Just because you're at an executive level or you're maybe an administrator that only functions on these servers, if there's a new technology coming into your environment, it behooves you, it's your responsibility even to learn, even if it's just at an introductory level about that technology and what it can do for you, because that may ring the alarm bell like, hey, this is going to impact these servers in this potential way. Maybe I need to be a little bit more aware of what's being integrated or coming into our environment. So even for new technology integrations or digital transformation projects, everybody's a stakeholder. It's going to impact everybody in different ways. It's going to impact your customers eventually. It impacts your service folks. It impacts your administrators, your teams, and so forth. So everything impacts everything, right? And so I think the key thing with being a CISO or CSO is that you got to be plugged in. You got to be plugged into the industry. You got to be plugged into the partners and technologies that are coming in. You got to be plugged into your own internal teams, and then your board. You're the conduit that has to be plugged into everything. And like you said, there's no one day or 1 week that's the same. So I really appreciate you sharing that perspective, because again, the purpose of even having this podcast is to offer people a perspective into different roles and different parts of the industry. But with that being said, I know, Naveen, you have more than just your day job going on. You have a lot of different things going on. Is there any personal projects or other sites or things that you're working on, even if it's a nonprofit or charity organization you support? Is there something you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I think one of the key things, and I think you touched on it earlier, and it resonated with me, is cybersecurity education should be free or minimal cost. And so over the last few years, I've been trying desperately to look at how much education is out there, and how does it help individuals. So actually one of the things that I've been trying to do is create as much free content as I can for people to digest. And I would encourage, if anyone else wants to jump on this bandwagon, I think is really important, is there are a lot of resources out there for people to learn about cyber. And as you said, YouTube is free, and there are lots of things, but they've got to be relevant. They've got to be short and poignant and to the point. But I don't see enough of it that entices and encourages people to change behavior, right? So I'm on kind of a little mission to, encourage my peer group, my colleagues, my friends, anyone that works in this industry. If you've got something to say that can help and benefit somebody in the space in which we work, in the communities in which we serve, then do it. Post out there, tag people, get opinions, share as much knowledge as you can. I think cybersecurity has become quite complicated for a lot of people, in the sense that they think it's really expensive. They think, it's very complicated, and we haven't helped the industry, and I say collective we in cyber, by using certain terminologies and languages that are hard to decipher. Let's get back to basics, right? And I would just encourage everyone that talks about this subject. Not everyone understands when we use acronyms, and we use abbreviations, and we try to distill things in a very technical way. We need to be better at communicating what the impact of not doing cyber is, because that's still a decision that you make. So yeah, I'm very passionate about education, and I think it's really important. And I think there are different types of education which can serve the public. And so yeah, I would encourage anyone in that space to step up, and I would encourage younger people that have got the skill sets to step up and get online and talk about it and make videos and do stuff, and just really yeah.
So you mentioned TikTok earlier, but what are some of the socials if people wanted to follow you and to see maybe what content you're putting out there? What are some socials or websites people can follow you? And of course, if there's any URLs, you could give them to me, and I'll make sure they're in the description of this podcast.
Sure. So I've taken a break for the summer, but yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm there. I do have an Instagram account which I post some stuff on. We've just started a TikTok, so not a lot of stuff on there. But yeah, generally, I'm posting a lot about small businesses on LinkedIn. It's sort of my primary focus. But yeah, if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, yeah, happy to share, other types of stuff that we've got going on over there.
Wonderful. And I'll make sure Naveen's links are in the description below. So click on that description and connect with Naveen. Naveen, I want to give you the last word. So, as a CISO working in multiple different industries and sectors, you mentioned a lot of times the small to medium business, and and the little guy, right, that's out there in this big threat landscape, that's kind of on their own. If you had a moment to speak to that small business owner or medium-sized business owner that is more vulnerable than they know, what is some advice you would give them right now?
I would say take stock of what you have. As a small business, it's really important to understand what you're doing in the space that you're doing it in. And let me just try to explain that. So, if you're a startup and you've got a bit of funding, and you're trying to make a go of something, really truly understand what it is you're trying to protect. Yeah. So what's the most critical asset that you have? Whether that's your consumer information, your customer data, transactional information. Just drill it down. Whiteboard it, put it out there. What's going to happen if I'm unable to service my customer? Right, due to a cybersecurity event or an information security event, and that then gives you a sense of what's important to you. So business criticality, so if it's availability, that's different, but if it's availability because of the lack of information resources that have had a significant impact, or integrity of data, whatever it may be, just sit back and think about what the impact is going to be on your business to be able to operate. And the second thing I would say then is go get some advice, right? and get it from multiple sources. Just because the advert says it does it, it doesn't mean it does. Yeah, and there are a lot of again, free resources. If you go to even my LinkedIn page, there are lots of free resources on there that you can take a look at. I think the key thing is then get some advice on what's appropriate for you. And if they're not telling you how to scale as you grow and how to secure as you grow, well, yeah, then there's questions you need to ask. So yeah, just think about what's important and then get advice on the best way to protect it.
I love it. And I guess to surmise that, Ted Lasso would say, be curious. So as a business owner, it is your responsibility to be curious. So Naveen, thank you so much for being the guest here on the podcast. Again, a wealth of information, and I appreciate your perspective into, what the life of a CISO is like. So thank you again so much.
Thanks a lot, Jim.